before we take the moment to get some experts in the room that aren't recruitment consultants like us, and to actually really delve into a few really interesting topics and about that relate to public sector procurement in general, but obviously tied into the Procurement Act and how that has landed, and what the kind of initial reaction to that is. So obviously myself and Lauren here from procurement heads and public sector practice here. But we also have on the call Verity from Constellia, head of procurement business partnering. We have Chris Robinson, obviously from the Reform Rundown podcast, which I've also been a guest of. So many thanks for returning the favour, Chris. And finally, we have Guy, head of consultancy services at Inprova. And so really, guys, I want to get straight into it and kick off and discuss, I guess, the assessing the scene and the state of play we currently find ourselves in, June 2025 in public sector procurement. And I think what we really like to kick off with is get a bit of early feedback and anything you guys are seeing from being, professionals in the space facing into the public sector and what you're seeing really. So if anyone wants to kick off in particular, that'd be great. But I am kind of inclined to pass it back immediately to Chris, given your thoroughbred podcasting heritage.
Thanks for that. No, I appreciate it. So I mean, I think in terms of the question, great question. And to answer that, I think you need to probably go back to the few days running up to the launch of PA23 in terms of procurement professionals, and more exclusively those, of course, within the public sector. From my perspective, of course, there was the well-documented record number of notices of around about, I think, 1,000 or so that was issued in the final days of the outgoing regulations here in the UK. And it felt like the sector was holding on to those regulations like a pair of comfy slippers, perhaps, and the sector had familiarity with those regulations. It was, of course, a well-trodden path. They knew the boundaries of them, the do's and don'ts, the precedents, the case laws, etc. And that was demonstrated by, the apparent mad dash to make final use of them in those few days running up to go live of the Act itself, of course. And for me, speaking from two procurement professionals from within the sector as part of my role, and the breadth of public sector clients the organisation I happen to work for has, in addition to, of course, the podcast itself, I don't think there's ever been a case of them being afraid of the Act coming into play. I mean, let's be honest, it's been a long time coming. As Flo and I often say, as part of the podcast, it has essentially been a 4 and a bit year long journey, the elongated implementation period, which arguably started way back in April 24. The full start, of course, October 24, and then leading up to, as you said, Gabriel, the 24th of February this year. That's a significant period of time, and not forgetting the modular-based training provided by the Government Commercial College, and again, the numerous deep dive sessions that were provided too. Just kind of like, when you take all that into consideration, in my opinion, the truth is a good number of public sector contracting authorities yet to commence their first or really significant procurement exercises via PA23. And as the stats have shown, even fewer have actually awarded procurements via the new regulations, and therefore yet to reap the rewards of undertaking procurement activity through this new regime.
Yeah, no, I think we spoke earlier a week or so ago, Chris, and I think you gave me a great stat at the time that you said it. I think it's around 553 at the time, and that was essentially 3 months in across the whole of UK, procurement. It's kind of really surprising, and I think part of it is going to be I think people took the deadline as let's get all of the big stuff through now, and we know what we're doing. And I think Verity, you mentioned to me fairly recently, also maybe some waiting on a bit of case law and things of that nature?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's reticence in the market generally. Like Chris was saying, it's a comfy pair of slippers. So people know the ins and outs. They know the case law. They know what they can and can't do underneath the old regs. And the new regs, despite the huge rafts of training and the push from the centre to get that information to everybody, there's still a lot of fear. What if I do it wrong? What if I haven't published every single notice? And I actually think the notices almost make people more afraid, because there are so many that you now need to publish in a certain order. And getting that administration done down to the level of contract, the value of contract that they need that now to be done at, there's fear around, oh my God, we could really quite easily screw this up if we don't publish these things in the right order. So not only is it getting procurement professionals trained, but then the procurement professionals have to take that information and that knowledge and that training. And, majority of, if you're looking at, I don't know, a local government authority or something like that, a lot of the procurement isn't done by a centralized team, right? It's done by people who aren't procurement people. They might be commissioners, they might be people who just randomly work in housing or something, and they need to know about these laws as well. So you've got this trickle down where everything needs to get through to all of the people that need to understand it. And that never even happened with PCR 2015, so right 100 days in, it's still going to be a long time coming to get everybody on the bandwagon of PA23, but there are so many great opportunities from it. If you take the administrative burden aside for a minute, I think that there are some brilliant ways that people can utilize the new regs to come up with more innovation and actually level the playing field as well for SMEs. So I think there's a lot of good stuff there, but it's going to be a while till we see the full remit of what can be done.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think obviously we're recording this the day after the spending review was announced as well. And obviously Rachel Reeves, essentially after the spring budget, this is the money. This is how we're actually going to divvy it up within the public sector, and what especially capital spending is going to be a big focus. We're seeing that in a few areas that whether it's housing, defence. There'll be some more kind of devolvement local government wise as well, which will be really interesting to see how that plays out. But I guess maybe there was a sense, from kind of time of budget and then spending review, that maybe much was never going to happen in this period anyway. People were looking at that and hoping for see what the budget's going to be, hopefully positively so. And there's now, I guess going forward, we're about to come into the summer period, but in 3 to 6 months, perhaps, as now people may know where the budget's going to land, and they can
and it could be some of those housing organisations and organisations where you have got the infrastructure that needs to be done in the summertime, like the school sector and places like that, and local government sectors, that actually they've been waiting for the perfect storm of enough time since the beginning of the Procurement Act to be able to start things. But I also and also the budget as well, but and the spending review. But I also think that that there will be a reliance on frameworks, right? For a lot of people, they don't want to step outside of the lines. They don't want to do anything until that case law is there, and they know all of those grey areas, of which there are many in the Act, have been bottomed out. Once they get to that point, I think they're just going to rely on a lot of frameworks until then. So it'll be interesting to see actually how framework spend is monitored, and whether there is an uptick, actually, whether less people are doing open competitions and more people are actually trying to find frameworks where possible to do stuff, just because of that, like I said, that slight fear of the unknown.
Yes, yeah, and also Guy, I know, Inprova do a lot of work within the housing sector, and social and affordable housing is going to be a big piece of that spending review. Tying that in, obviously, to the initial impacts of the Procurement Act. What are your thoughts into how that's going to pivot for the rest of the year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge amount of positivity off the back of the spending review. I think we've got £39 billion affordable housing programme. We've got a 10-year rent settlement at CPI plus 1% from 2026. So I think that's huge for the sector. I think for me, procurement once again has an opportunity to step up and support the delivery of some really fundamental changes within the UK. And I guess for me, we've been here before in terms of procurement having that watershed moment of, we had PCR 2015, we've had spending reviews before when procurement have been touted as the light to save the public sector and not quite hit the mark. And I guess that's where I think procurement needs to do more and be better and be stronger and be the leader, because it can be, and it can make a fundamental change, and it can deliver more and better. So I think that's where, you know, kind of we're having the conversations with our customers, and as Verity said, I think, you know, from an ease point of view and a compliance point of view, frameworks and the current DPS and the future dynamic market space is going to probably grow, I think, based on the sentiment we're seeing, because they're a safe space, they're a known space, and you know, for that big contentious spend area where you're going to do these big development programs, actually, you know, is it easier to just tread safely than go for something new, wild and different, which, you know, we're all feeling our way through at the moment, you know, consultants and procurement professionals in the public sector.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think it's, you know, a bit of hesitancy, I think, to recap for a couple of different reasons. But now, you know, for a couple of, you know, reasons on the other side, post-spending reviews, post-budget, hopefully we get a bit of case law through, a bit of traction, and it could then, you know, a bit of a, yeah, it's a bit of a domino effect, and we could see a lot more kind of above threshold kind of activity, and I guess taking, you know, some of the advantages of the Procurement Act, which I think, from what we're hearing, you know, a lot of people can see, but maybe just haven't had the chance, or maybe on purposely not, you know, made the chance to make use of. Yeah, Chris.
Gabriel, can I just say a few words in terms of suppliers, and, you know, again, what we're hearing, and conversations that, you know, I and Fleur actually, you know, as part of the podcast, had conversations with suppliers, you know, who actively look to compete for public sector procurement opportunities. I think it's quite interesting, actually, in these early, like, formative stages post go live, that maybe I'm going to say something perhaps a little controversial here, but I personally don't think enough has been done to take suppliers on that journey, you know, leading up to go live.
Agreed.
You know,
Agreed.
I'm glad you're agreeing. I think my memory might be a bit hazy, and I'm sure you guys will keep me honest on this, but outside of a 4 to 5 page quick guide, if you will, and a couple of awareness sessions that were put on for them, I don't actually recall anything of any real significance.
It's a massive risk area. I remember back a few years ago when they pulled together sort of industry experts, and we were all feeding into meetings with Lucy. I was working at RBKC Council at the time, so I was on a number of those calls, and the feedback that was coming really loud and clear from everybody on those feedback calls was, we need to make sure we're engaging with suppliers in the supply chain. And you're completely right, Chris, because the centres, I think the centre was like, well, you know, these are the big companies that supply to everybody, so we'll write letters to them, but the rest of you need to work out how you're going to tell your supply chain. So again, that's been left in the hands very much of the local resource, who are running around like headless chickens trying to deliver it. But I don't disagree at all. I think there's still a lot of suppliers that are going to be blinded by things like the central digital platform and stuff like that, which in itself is a good idea, but actually they just don't know that it's there.
No, exactly. And again, you know, I'm sure that all you in probably same events from both a regional and national perspective. You know, I think about Procurement Act Live that took place in Birmingham around about 3 days after launch. More recently, we've had Procure X National taking place in Liverpool, etc. And, you know, when you've been speaking to public sector contracting authorities, there's been a buzz in the room, there's been some excitement around the Act and the opportunities that it provides. I'm sure we'll go into much more detail around this later on and what have you. But again, I think back to the suppliers and the dialogue I've had with suppliers, as I'm sure you have too, that, you know, the overarching one is of interest and excitement in that PA23 could start to unlock many of the barriers and limitations that the previous regulations had. So hopefully, you know, it means public sector opportunities become more attainable to them. But yeah, as I say, there hasn't been a fat lot in terms of intel and information sharing to them. I don't believe anyway, up to, you know, to this point at least.
Yeah, so I guess now it's a case of, you know, looking to the future. There's going to be a few different avenues that, based on what we are seeing and what we're predicting, that are going to be really good discussion points.
I think we talk about procurement and we naturally talk about the process of it. I'm a big advocate of procurement is done by people, and procurement is about people. And I think that's the biggest challenge we've now got. We've got this new set of regulations and a new kind of dynamic that we want procurement to be. And I think without people, we're not going to get that to work. And I think this is the challenge and the conversation I'm having at the moment is how do we deliver procurement in this new world? How do we make the most of the opportunities that have been created for us? And how do we change kind of the landscape? And this will lead a little bit into what Chris is going to talk about. But I think for me, procurement, as the perennial challenge for procurement is about translating law into something that your stakeholders and your customers can understand, and that's internal customers within your business, but equally your suppliers as well. And I think, again, for the challenge for procurement is about understanding your customers. What does their business look like? What's their pain points? What's their pressures? I've always said procurement needs to be embedded within the team, within the business. So, for me in my career, I've worked in local authorities, and actually just sitting with the team, embedding myself within them, within their bit of the business is really important. And sometimes that's ugly. It means getting your elbows out, getting in there, forcing your way into the conversation, forcing yourself into budget setting meetings. I think is really valuable and really important, but it doesn't happen because if procurement doesn't have that seat at the top table, that relationship with finance, you're not going to get in those budget setting meetings and understand where that money is going to be spent and where it's being spent. It's a key part of the role. So I think, for me, it keeps going back to people. And I think, again, we're really good in procurement at defaulting to process and defaulting to the rule book and saying, sorry guys, the rules say you can't do that. And I've always said it should be a no, but it's okay to say no, but don't offer a barrier, offer a solution. So you're the professional, understand the grey, understand the ability, the opportunities, and offer something as an alternative. And I think that's where we've really got to focus our effort as procurement professionals now. And that, for me, I think the one thing I'm seeing, and again, I think Chris is probably going to touch on this, but the one thing I'm seeing is we're still doing procurement in the same way. We've got all of this new stuff around supplier engagement, around a policy driver about engaging SMEs, the voluntary and community sector, and we've still got processes being advertised that are overly document focused, lots and lots of questions, lots and lots of barriers, and a real lack of engagement with the supply chain prior to the documents being issued. And that's what I really want to see changing. And that's what we're focusing really heavily on with our customers and members is conversation is really important now. Conversation will drive innovation, it will drive change, and it will drive better process. So I think that's the big thing I'm really passionate about is turning the dial on procurement to focus on the people, focus on suppliers, focus on your business partners and your internal customers, and that will unlock the next stage. Training is one thing.
Yeah, no, for sure. One thing I'd like to maybe put to Chris or Verity, my kind of responsible reactions to that. I always think, for my sins, I've always been in procurement recruitment, but previously I did a lot of work in the private sector, and since moved into public sector procurement recruitment. And from what I can tell, you may correct me on this, is a bit of this. It could be maybe a kind of top-down historical, I don't want to say problem, or but in other industries, procurement, there's a CPO. I think that's quite still, an emerging or rare thing in the public sector. And so for you get to maybe a director, and then director reports into the CFO and is not in the C-suite, not on the board. And when they're in the initial discussions around budget and strategy, it filters down, and procurement, therefore, in public sector seems to, at a point, always be slightly more reactive in that sense. And I'm not sure if maybe that speaks to something that you're saying around that, having that kind of seat at the table, really, and that's and quite literally, and with people who are making decisions in organisations, Yeah, I'm not sure if it, you know, Verity or Chris, if you think there's anything in that.
Yeah, completely. But this is not a new problem, right? The procurement have been asking for a seat at the table since procurement changed from purchasing to procurement, and now we're changing for, you know, rebranding, trying to become more commercial with the Procurement Act and everything as well. And like, look at the suite of actually the skills of what people can do and do in procurement is actually quite wide-reaching and wide-ranging, and really sits umbrella over an organization, touch points in so many different parts that it makes sense to have somebody at that senior level. You're lucky if you even get a director in some organizations. Head of is the very, very highest they will go. Actually, in some, you know, I come from a background as well in the charity sector. In some of the charities, a procurement manager is the highest you're going to get, and you'll have one of those and you'll be happy about it. Do you know what I mean? So it's still seen as quite an old, I think there's still quite an old view of what procurement actually is and what it can do. And the understanding isn't necessarily there in some organizations of, like I said, the wide-reaching range of what we can be involved in and how procurement can actually help. And if we want to be, like Guy was saying, I suppose the savior, you know, of what can be done, you know, help deliver these budgets, help deliver all of these fantastic outcomes, then, you know, we actually do need to be raised up in the organization. So completely agree.
Yeah,
I think
Chris, in terms of the, oh yeah, no, you're probably going to go. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, I think there's a decision for organisations to make as well in what they want procurement to be, and I think, you know, from what Verity has said, you know, actually procurement do want to be more and better and bigger and have more influence, but actually there are still a significant amount of senior leaders who don't see the value in procurement and just want compliance and project delivery and nothing more, and stay in your lane, stay in your box, and as long as we're compliant, I'm happy with that. And actually a growing number of leaders want that transformational leadership approach from procurement. So I think actually there's a really valuable conversation to be had across the public sector at large, as within organisations, but as a sector, what do we want procurement to be?
Yeah,
because it's okay to be tactical, but you have to accept that comes with some limitations.
Yeah. Do you think, Chris, do you think the Procurement Act itself has, you know, with the you know, pieces that Guy's talking about there being more kind of solutions focused, is that something that you can see kind of trending in that sense?
Yeah, and I think actually, you know, they have the solutions, and for the most part, they've always had the solutions. It's just that the fact that a procurement function, a department within a singular organisation doesn't necessarily get listened to, or perhaps maybe take it a step back, understood by its other departments and functions within the same organisation. I'm going to say something now that might offend, and I don't mean to do this, but I'm going to take a guess here in terms of those of us on this call as guests today are roughly around about the same age. I've just had a harder life, and therefore we've had similar numbers of years experience within procurement. But I think this will resonate with everybody here in that we have certainly seen this, and Verity touched on this kind of transformation from the purchasing department to procurement. And as you see, you know, and has been for too long a time now, unfortunately, issues with the economic climate, you know, more exclusively here in the UK and within the public sector, of course, etc. There's been, thankfully now, this realisation that, you know, there's this requirement to have to do more with less in terms of ever reducing budgets, and other departments and functions and directors of those other departments and functions within the organisation have made this connection, they've made this realisation, and that is this. You know, that function and department that we've always had in our organisation that is probably about as popular as internal audits. They would be quite useful and helpful in terms of achieving us, you know, getting more with less, with ever reducing budgets. And I think what we are thankfully starting to see now is procurement professionals involved, included, part of that top table conversations within organisations, and just the profile of procurement in general as a profession has grown because of that. You know, that's my kind of interpretation of it anyway.
Perfect. Well, we just had a really interesting talk to kick us off, the guy brought to the table. So many thanks for that. Now we're going to turn to Verity. I think you're really keen to bring to the table discussing, I guess, innovation of procurement in the public sector and on that piece. So yeah, be really interested to hear what you have to say on this.
Yeah, no problem. I think in relation to the Procurement Act, right, the Procurement Act is being bandied around as a tool to innovate in procurement. And I think in the right hands, we've got some absolutely incredible opportunities here within the Act, albeit there are some grey areas that probably do need to be bottomed out with a bit of case law. But actually, if you do it correctly and you follow the guidance, we've got a brilliant tool in the competitive flexible procedure where you can basically design what you want that procurement to look like, and it includes all of the good stuff that we've already talked about kind of engaging with the market and looking at SMEs and looking at how we can make sure that, you know, we're taking that learning from the market and moving that forward through our procurement processes. I think too long we've been a bit frightened of talking to the market because, oh no, what if it's bias? And it's like, actually no, because you're in procurement, or potentially even your stakeholders might not know all of the intel of all of the new innovation and all of the fabulous things that are happening within the market unless you're talking to the market. If you do that in a controlled manner and you understand how to do it and you're doing it properly, then it's an absolutely fantastic tool to then create an innovative procurement process from that feedback. And you can look at bringing in all sorts of different types of things into this process, right? So you can run it, you know, you might have done a couple of competitive dialogues before, so you can run it just like a competitive dialogue if you want to, or you can have numerous different types of stages. You can have a negotiation, you can have an e-auction as part of it, you can have interpretive, well, probably not interpretive dance, but you can have a number you can have a number of different things in there, right, which make it completely fit for purpose for the market that you are engaging with. I think what's quite difficult is if you're doing a bog standard procurement, right, and you're buying pens and paper and stuff like that, it's fairly straightforward. There are lots of tried and tested routes to market. But if you're looking at complicated areas like social care, like housing, like defence, like innovation, research and development, pilot projects, stuff like that, it's a tricky, messy way of getting into market. So by having a procurement process which you can shape based on the market that you're going to really allows you to drive innovation and hopefully find new suppliers that can deliver your outcomes that you want them to deliver. And that was kind of what I wanted to talk about, really, and get everyone's opinions on kind of innovating with the competitive flexible procedure. Anyway, I mean, you don't all have to jump at once.
I'm just keen to understand, Verity, what weighting we're going to apply to interpretive dance. I mean, you know,
I think, you know, it depends on the market. I think if you're going out to construction, it's a really high weighting on interpretive dance.
This is what we want: innovation, definitely.
Innovation.
Good stuff.
This is a skill set thing again, isn't it? It's like you've rightly said, Verity. We've got traditionally people who have been scared to talk to suppliers for fear of doing something wrong, and that's a fair challenge. And actually, you know, certainly in housing, we've got a lot of people coming into the sector from the private sector into procurement, and they bring a different skill set than we've had before. And I think that's great, because I think those kind of approaches around that typical private sector approach of negotiation and actually just having that down and dirty conversation with key suppliers, I think that's brilliant, and that is going to drive some of that innovation. And I think for me, it's you know, that those conversations aren't going to happen in your small HA that's only got 5,000 homes, but actually for your big local authorities, for your G15, I think, you know, we should be seeing them leading the show in terms of that innovative procurement and doing something a little bit different. I guess the caveat I jokingly say to those bigger customers is we have to make sure we don't go back to the bad times of those really elongated competitive dialogue processes that people just kind of hold their head in their hands to say, oh yeah, do you remember that 2-year project that we all spent loads of time and money on that never then went anywhere? So yeah, I'm all for it. I think it's fantastic, and yeah, great. If I can bring some Amdram into a process as well, I'm here for that as well.
I love that. I think it's like you said, like you touched on, it's skill set, isn't it? It's the commercialization of procurement. So PA trying to push people into a slightly more commercial way of thinking, like you touched on, a slightly more private sector way of thinking, but within the remit of there being some boundaries and barriers around what we're doing and it being done in an ethical manner, etc., etc. It's still very much say what you're going to do what you say, award your contract. That's not changed, but it's actually the flexibility within that you've got to be able to design. I mean, I'm working on some R&D projects where they don't really know what it is that they want it to be at the end, so you're kind of going through this iterative process and talking to suppliers and helping the suppliers are helping you sort of shape what's coming out the other side. So the easiest thing I can relate that to is a competitive dialogue, but you kind of twist it, you can twist it around a little bit and make it a bit more funky, right? And just deliver something that's really fit for purpose for that very specific project. So I think I sound excited because I am excited. I think it's a really fun piece of procurement legislation, if there is such a thing.
Right. It's going to require a behaviour and culture change as well, though, isn't it? I think, particularly within the public sector, with the previous regulations being around for such a long time, and people, clinging on to for dear life like a handrail, and then all of a sudden these proverbial stabilisers have been taken off, and go create, go innovate, and I'm sure we'll discuss it at some point. The activity around the preliminary market engagement, I think, will certainly help that. But it's also, the point that Guy mentioned as well in terms of smaller organisations, including but outside of HAs as well, is that to be able to order to do this and do this properly, it's going to be quite resource intensive as well. I'd suggest. Yeah.
Agreed.
And it needs people to have a seat, I think, higher up in the organisation as well. So if you've got that strategic leadership that understands what the innovation and the flexibility of these new regimes can do and how procurement and commercial can support that and move that forward, again, it kind of just adds value to what the procurement team can do for that organisation, right?
Yeah. And that mindset change around, one of you said it, but outcomes, and actually outcomes is the biggest factor that will drive that innovation and the process. Is if you can get people to stop thinking about the way they want it to be delivered and actually focus on the end goal, which is, I want my customers to have a safe home where they feel safe, where they feel comfortable, where they're not living in damp mold conditions and all of that stuff. Actually, if you think about it like that, then actually you're enabling the suppliers to come up with something a little bit different, and the dialogue becomes, as you say, quite funky, quite interesting, quite cool, and that's where we should get excited.
Yeah. And, you've got a brilliant opportunity there in that to bring prices down, to speak, for the market to speak on what's happening in the market, to come up with new variants on how they price things. It's not just the same old time and materials. You're looking at output-based specifications. You're looking at how can we set these milestones in place so people are paid for their deliverables and not just every month so-and-so worked this amount of time, which works in some places, but actually, it's time to start thinking and turning things on their head a little bit, see how we can be more commercial and sort of collaborate with the market, I think.
Yeah, I think my read of part of the Act as well seems to really drive a bit more, post-award contract management and commercial management, which in public sector procurement has a lot of the time been, you've had sourcing, really, procurement was sourcing, tender management, market engagement, and then it got passed off maybe to commercial management or maybe just a stakeholder to be like, there you go, there's the contract award, and now we move on to the next one. Do we think that more incentive to have the full life cycle of a contract therefore means you're going to have to think about outcomes more naturally from that?
I think we would hope so. I think there's still a big learning curve to, I think, the stakeholders that are going to need to manage those contracts, especially the ones that hit that threshold for the publication of the KPIs every quarter. Obviously, you've got the spend data as well being published, the payment data being published. So people are soon going to know if those contracts aren't being managed properly. But I think probably a bit more training and engagement with the stakeholders when people have time to do it, I don't know, but that are managing those contracts is going to be really important.
For sure. I think also as well, it'll actually be, again, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of change in mindset and culture. It's going to be performance driven, not conformance, which again, public sector are well versed in, the conformance side of things. So it is looking ahead. It's the points that's just been mentioned in terms of looking ahead in terms of if you've got a 3, 4, 5 year contract in place of, what are the suitable KPIs to be set out from the outset, and will they still in fact apply, in years 2, 3, 4 and 5 of that contract arrangement, for example? So yeah, it's going to be quite a change.
I think the risk as well is the fact that it dumbs down KPIs.
Yeah.
So, we've got to pick 3 KPIs, quick, put anything in there because it's got to be, and then we've got to publish it. And you actually end up in a potentially, hopefully that won't happen, but you could end up in a worse situation.
I agree. I think there's a real risk that you move into a space of KPIs become a box tick again, for fear of offending, but social value. I've talked to some customers who've said, I'm going to have 3 blanket KPIs and I'm going to insert those 3 same KPIs in every single contract I do because it's easy. Okay, yeah, fair play. It's easy, but actually, is it right? And is it going to drive the right behavior and right outcomes in your contract? No, absolutely it isn't. And I think there's a skill set training thing again for me. I came from a local authority background. I was a contract manager within a local council. I absolutely wasn't a contract manager. I didn't have the required training, but the role I was doing, I was just managing a contract as part of that role. And I think we've got a lot of people who are contract managers by default or by accident or by the fact that they've just moved up the tier. And actually, the ability to effectively manage performance is another skill set we need to wrestle with in the public sector and get a real handle on and again change the dial on. And I think procurement can play a role in that and should play a role in that. And there's a case for in your bigger organizations centralizing contract management to make it consistent, or even having that center-led approach where you're sort of more mid-tier. But yeah, I think it's something we should be having active conversations with our customers and within our organizations about how do we do this and how do we do it well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just wondering, Verity and Guy, can we, collectively make a promise on this, and it's recorded as well, in that on KPIs and selection of KPIs, when we're speaking to colleagues, clients within the public sector, when they use the term boilerplate KPIs, can we just shut those conversations?
There's no such thing. Yeah, okay, I swear, Girl Guide's on it.
Agreed. Absolutely agree. Yes. I think setting a guide out and a template and some ideas is a great thing, but as you say, Chris, boilerplate is not the right way to go.
That is going to bring us to our final, specific topic to bring to the table from Chris. I know we've touched on SMEs a couple of times in conversations, but I know you're going to really kind of do a bit of a deeper dive in terms of the relationship between public procurement and SMEs.
Yes, certainly. And I think, as you say, the almost strategic partnerships between SMEs and the public sector. And, I've kind of thought about this and looked at this from almost kind of 3 strands or perspectives, if you will. And I think, sometimes, as is often the case, you have to look a little bit back in order to go forward. And I think you think about like the previous challenges, or certainly PA23, the barriers SMEs face when engaging with public sector procurement. I think, just a little bit of a stat to start off with, and one that, certainly both Fleur and I have used on the podcast and mentioned at events previously, is that, SMEs, small, medium enterprises, actually make up for, and this is where it's quite mind-blowing, 99.9% of the UK business population. And that was from the start of last year, would you believe? And then a 99.2% of them being small businesses with fewer than 50 employees. So, no doubt many will be micro SMEs, if you will. In terms of numbers, that is estimated to be around about 5.5 million SMEs in totality in the UK. Traditionally, where to start, as what are the biggest barriers for SMEs when engaging with public sector contracting authorities? Well, I think it is exactly that. Where, in fact, do they start? And we'll get into that in a bit more detail in terms of how PA23 looks to alleviate such issues in a moment. I think what's important to remember is the acronym SME and what it actually stands for. And whilst the range of that categorisation, at least in my opinion, is a little too wide. They are in essence organisations with finite resource. I worked directly as an employee within public sector for 20 years, and in hindsight, I can imagine the disappointment on the face of an SME when they receive a 100-page plus ITT, not to forget in addition the likelihood of a pre-qual document beforehand. And I think the reality of it is these opportunities would typically be high value, resource intensive, and let's be honest, out of reach for SMEs, with them often only accessible to the bigger players out there whom, would no doubt have a tender bid team armed and ready to complete a submission. So that's under the previous regulations, and as an SME bidding for public sector opportunities, almost as if, and Fleur would, if she were on this conversation, look at me as she does on the podcast thinking, what on earth is he on about now? But just bear with me a moment. It's a little bit like, and I know I certainly need to do this, you're on a diet and someone is dangling this huge cake in front of you and you want that cake, but it's no good for you, and it's not worth your time and it's not worth your effort, and you'll only result in being disappointed. And I think that's kind of the background prior thinking around SMEs and looking at participating for public sector contract opportunities. So, all in all, barriers would typically be where to look, what to compete for. Remember, time bidding for opportunities is time when they aren't earning an income, who to speak to, how to get early intel to prepare and understand the procurement needs. I can only imagine it's a pretty lonely and challenging environment at times for them. So that's kind of like the looking back piece, if you will. In terms of here and now and looking forward, in terms of looking to improve opportunities for SMEs under the Act itself, I think this is much more positively, and what PA23 provides is a light at the end of that once very dark tunnel. I'm not sure, exactly when this recording is going out, but at this current time, I'm a few days away from actually delivering a presentation myself on unlocking opportunities for SMEs by the use of PA23 at a SIPS event. So I'm sure that's going to result in some interesting dialogue and opinions. I think what we've got to remember here is that the Act has gone pretty hard when it comes to the active encouragement of the inclusion of SMEs within public contracting authorities, and for good reason. When you think about those stats that I referred to earlier on and the percentage makeup of SMEs here in the UK, that's a lot of untapped potential, skill sets, niche capabilities, which for the most part have previously been overlooked by contracting authorities. And I think also mindful to remember that this is the UK Procurement Act, not the wider EU. This is all good for the UK economy. It's about growth, driving innovation, upskilling people. There's over 5.5 million SMEs in the UK, so let's make use of them. I think about obviously some of the points that both Guy and Verity have made up to this point, but when you think about the plethora of notices that are available now, both good and bad reasons, one would suggest, but the release of the pipeline notices is a huge step in the right direction in achieving what, in my view, is one of the reasons behind its introduction as part of PA23. And that's designed to support SMEs and VCSEs in terms of getting prepared by providing early visibility of upcoming opportunities. Pipeline notices help such organisations to plan resources, encourage innovation, much of what Verity mentioned just now, and ultimately look to increase their chances of securing contracts. There's so many things we can talk about in this space, but another obvious area is the introduction of the preliminary market engagement notices. Now, one might argue that whilst via a differing terminology, this is an opportunity that's always been around. However, I don't think it has previously been utilised as well as I'm hoping it will do now. If I was an SME, after getting registered onto the central digital platform, and let's be honest, CPD is something that requires its own conversation, I'd be on high alert looking out for those preliminary market engagement notices against my areas of deliverables. These provide informal opportunities for dialogue with contracting authorities about a procurement need, give SMEs that proverbial peek behind the curtain in relation to the ask prior to formal procurement, the chance to build a relationship with contracting authorities and establish a point of contact, share ideas, opportunity to demonstrate innovation, showcase capabilities, and ultimately help them to determine the opportunity that is on offer for the SME in question is right, in fact, for them to pursue. And let's be honest, here for contracting authorities, the use and the application of preliminary market engagement, it's free consultancy. What's there not to like? Yeah. I think kind of finally, just on closing on the SME point, in terms of digital platforms and transparency and the role it plays around fostering SME participation, we've mentioned already how imperative it is for SMEs to get registered on the central digital platform. And for me, I think that's your ticket to ride for all public sector contract opportunities. So, the one thing I'd say to SMEs is do it, get on it and do it. And the same can be said for the pipeline notices and, of course, the preliminary market engagement notices. I mean, that's transparency at its finest and how it should be, of course. This is early side of opportunities, and it's essential for all the reasons I've mentioned earlier. If you change it up a bit, Tell Us Once functionality has purposely been introduced to reduce time taken by suppliers to access public procurement opportunities. Your mandatory typical supplier information that gets asked of them every single time they participate in a procurement exercise will be held on there. And of course, it'll be on the SMEs and suppliers in general to update pertinent information when circumstances change. But, overall, it's a positive step and about time too. I did say I wasn't going to go into a central digital platform, and I am going to break my promise slightly here, but I'm sure, we can all agree that the concept, and in fact, it was mentioned earlier, the idea, its intended purpose is a great one, but it is in fact work in progress. Yeah. We're just over 100 days since go live. It's going to evolve, it's going to grow, it's going to improve over time. So I think it is a case of watch this space. It's a situation, and as a situation, and doing so with, I think, ultimately an air of great positivity.
I think on top of that as well, we've got not only the National Procurement Policy Statement, which obviously ties very heavily into the use of SMEs and engaging with them in the market and making sure that you do it, but you've also got the bit in the legislation which stipulates that you have to break things down into lots, if you can break it down into lots, to be able to stimulate SMEs and to be able to, rather than just going, here's this massive contract and putting it out to one of the big four or whatever and for it to be delivered. It's actually, if you can break it down, you need to break it down into lots, and you need to publish, if you haven't broken it down, why you haven't broken it down into lots, which I think is a really interesting addition to the legislation, which hopefully will also stimulate the SME economy a bit.
Yeah, it really gets contracting authorities in the mindset of, what have you done to make these contract opportunities available to those circa 5.5 million organisations that fall under that bracket for sure.
Yeah.
It's on procurement to force that conversation as well, isn't it? In terms of kind of, we talk about with our customers about that approval to procure. So you've set out your stall. How are you going to do this? Why are you doing it? What's the context? And, it should be all those, it should just form part of that standard question that gets asked in terms of, have you had the conversation around SMEs and barriers and as well as TUPE and, all those standard things that we always kind of talk about, and, Section 20 and customer consultation. It just has to be just the default in every single process in terms of, that consideration. And I think, again, it's getting past people's bias as well, as in, look, we've probably all done procurement in the past and treading that fine line of you invariably get that internal customer that will come to you and say, I want this thing and I want this supplier to do it. And following that through, but actually just defaulting back to the supplier you've always used and you've got a great relationship with isn't going to drive innovation, and it isn't going to unlock those opportunities to do something a little bit different and better. And so I think there's work to be done, but just to completely agree with your point, I think, Chris, there's a huge step forward here. It's on us to make the most of it, isn't it, as always?
Sure.
I think we would agree, as heads of resourcing group, we are a small business, we are an SME ourselves, and actually we've been looking a lot more recently about our access to the public sector, and we are growing that space. And actually I think the opportunity that comes with the Procurement Act is really exciting as an SME, and I think like Verity said, breaking those contracts down into lots has been really helpful, because we've been looking at things recently, and we've been looking at actually where can we provide our skills, and where can we deliver, whereas before we would have looked at the overall contracts and gone, well, we can't deliver on 95% of this, so there's probably no point us looking at it. Whereas now, where it's broken down into lots, we can say, actually, yeah, we can deliver almost 100% on lots X, Y, and Z, or 1, 2, and 3, and it gives us a bit more motivation to go through the process and put in that work. But like you say, I think it's really important to have that communication between procurement teams and contracting authorities and the SMEs to make it as straightforward and as simple as possible. Because I think, like Chris mentioned, the time that we would need to put into writing a bid and things like that is time away from potential profitability elsewhere in the business. So it has to be around the collaboration between the two to make things simple and really open those opportunities for the SMEs.
Yeah. I think procurement obviously has a huge role to play in stating the obvious here in terms of being an information giver and provider. And all this noise around the digital age and the evolution within business environment, let's strip it back to basics. If done properly, clearly and efficiently, digital platforms and the use of them, which will only improve information flow. And I think, that in turn, when considering what we've mentioned up to this point, will only serve to improve that transparency piece, and with even larger magnifying glass that's on public sector procurement within the introduction of PA. So yeah, I think it's all positive steps, definitely.
I think the practical delivery of this, removing barriers and making a process work for SMEs, is the bit that a lot of organisations haven't cracked yet.
Yeah.
It's that juxtaposition of, you work in the local authority, for example, heavily regulated, heavily risk averse. I want to see your policy on modern slavery. I want to see your policy on safeguarding. I want to see 25 different policies from you as an organisation, and that's just one example of how do you balance that need for compliance and control and risk management, but also run an effective process that enables an SME to easily look at it and go, I can deliver that. I might not have 25 policies written, but I can definitely deliver that contract for you, and I've got a record of safety and experience and delivery. And I think that's just kind of one example of where I think we still need some work. And again, there will be that sort of lead by example from other organisations and sharing of best practice and all that stuff. And I think,
I was just going to say, sorry, that I think SRM and the skill set around SRM and supply chain management are going to become even more important. I mean, most procurement teams don't even have enough people procuring in the procurement teams, let alone doing SRM and social value and all of that fantastic stuff. But actually, having someone who can lead an SRM that can potentially deliver sessions to SMEs. If you're a local authority, as an example, you want to be stimulating your local economy, right? You want to be seeing what you're doing in your local economy. So really having someone in your authority that is looking after that local economy and ensuring that the opportunities are there for them, that they understand what to do, upskilling them, helping them with policies, all of this great stuff, then actually that role becomes really, really important in ensuring that SMEs can access those types of contracts.
Yeah, I think the only thing I was thinking about then when you're talking, I guess, given that example, local government organisation, and from speaking with these kind of organisations, what's the feeling around from their point of view about, we can now kind of really open up and try and work with SMEs?
I think from the ones that I've spoken to, it is very much they want to stimulate their local economy, and they want to. So a lot of the time they try and use social value as a kind of tool to be able to stimulate the local economy, right? But actually, it's perhaps maybe time that we start asking them to step outside of that and just think about how you can look at this collectively as a council or a group of councils that look after a certain area. How can you work together and ensure that you have really good commissioning, really good procurement, really good contract management to be actually able to keep that economy going and stimulate that economy and make sure they know what they're doing. There are various different ways you could do it, right? These roles don't have to sit in procurement. They can sit in other places in the organizations, but actually it's having that link to the local SMEs and the local supply chain, which I think will really help deliver some of this great output that we want to see coming out of Procurement Act. And I think it's up to councils to have a bit, or generally procurement in contracting authorities to have grown-up conversations with other areas of the business to talk about how they can do that collectively.
I'm just thinking back now to an event where Flo and I presented back at the. Do you know, ironically, I think it was around about October of last year, so just before the original go live date, if you will, and we're at London South Bank University, and it was an event that was purely focused on SMEs and micro SMEs. There's about 200 in the room back then. And, bearing in mind it was full steam ahead for that initial October date. And the reality of it was, yes, they're enthused. They wanted to help. They wanted to support. Naturally, they want to be part of delivering, and being contractors on public sector contract arrangements themselves. But their knowledge of procurement, how to participate, how to get side of opportunities, etc., was next to none. And again, referring back to what I mentioned earlier around suppliers' knowledge in relation to PA23 and what they've actually been provided with was again next to nothing. So it goes back to again what we've discussed already, that contracting authorities in the public sector do have a role to play in speaking to their local SMEs and making sure that they are mindful of these opportunities and part of these future procurement exercises that take place.
Yeah, excellent, fantastic. Well, I really appreciate that discussion, and Chris, thanks for bringing that one. And now we'll look to progress on to final closing questions. Cool. Lauren.
I think the conversation's been really insightful, whether that be for procurement teams in contracting authorities or whether that be SMEs. We've covered a lot of topics, which has been great. But from our side, what we would love to get from you now is your closing statements and your final advice. What would you each like to see in the next 6 to 12 months when it comes to the Procurement Act? Don't mind who goes first.
Who's going to go first?
Let's go, Verity. Go on.
Well, kind of tying back to what I was talking about earlier, I really would like to see more people exercising the flexibility that the Act allows them to do. Sure, that takes a bit of learning and a bit of understanding and a bit of commitment, I think, from the contracting authority as well. But there's some absolutely brilliant gains to be had. So I'm looking forward to seeing some innovative, flexible procedures coming out and some delivering some fantastic results, hopefully, over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think innovation has got to be sort of at the centre of what everyone is doing to really get the best out of this new regulation. Chris, from your side, what would you like to see in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for me, it's pretty simple, really. Best practice, together with the, dare I say, the good, bad, and the ugly of the experiences that the sector and suppliers will have inevitably have experienced since the introduction of PA23. I think something that the sector has always done well and will continue to do so is collaborate. So, keep going on that trajectory in terms of sharing experiences, sharing ideas. Going back to, again, much of what Verity discussed previously, be innovative, be creative, work with suppliers. They are partners and therefore, by default, extensions to your organisations and not opponents. And I think, for that very reason, I personally cannot wait to see the range of KPIs that are produced and how they're logged within contract performance notices and subsequently managed as well, of course. And I think, the procurement geek in me believes that there are lots of things to be positive about and to look forward to, certainly over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, I think it's really good to have someone say, we need to look at it in terms of best practice, but also look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, because I think sometimes we always want to talk about when things are going right, but ultimately as humans we don't learn unless we make mistakes, and actually sometimes making that mistake or things haven't gone quite right, we can share that and share it with a wider community than just your existing team, and everyone can learn from it, and we can sort of develop what is happening within the procurement space at a faster rate, I think.
Absolutely,
And Guy, from your side.
I think it's a combination of what Verity and Chris have said. I think for me, it's, you know, I go back to my communication point, and I think talking about procurement, talking at the right stage to the right people about the right things is fundamental to success and unlocking the opportunities. And I think, you know, for me, how I'd measure that in 6 months is something Chris said, how many preliminary market engagement notices are we seeing? How many suppliers are still banging the same old drum of this is a hard process to get involved in, and we've heard nothing from our contracting authority, who we're already in contract with, but the contract's ending shortly, and I don't know what's happening. That's a typical complaint that we get. So I feel like more communication, more talking. As Chris rightly said, suppliers are an extension of your business. Understanding who those strategic suppliers are, and talking to them regularly about what are you doing for us, what aren't you doing for us, what could you do for us. I think that's just a really important conversation to have at a number of different levels within your organization, whether it's the chief exec, director, or operational lead. I think for me, do more, be more, communicate more.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is coming down to that kind of, you know, maybe brave is the wrong word, but almost kind of taking the shackles off, the kind of maybe the initial hesitancy. And you know, I think that there's so much potential to be gained, and yeah, mistakes are going to be made, like Chris said, good, the bad, and the ugly, you know, but you don't learn to walk by watching someone walk. You have to try and do it yourself, and you fall over, but you know, in doing so you get there, and it will, you know, there's a lot to be gained, a lot of potential, and hopefully over the next 6-12 months we're gonna see that come to fruition. So excellent, fantastic, really good closing thoughts there, and appreciate everyone's time. I think it's been an excellent discussion around public procurement, and you know, within the Procurement Act itself as well. I'm really excited to kind of get this out to our networks and your networks, and hopefully kind of keep the discussion going, and yeah, be interesting to see over the coming months how things develop and change based on what we've discussed. But yeah, Guy, Verity, and Chris, really appreciate you all making time and coming on and joining us to take a really engaging and thoughtful conversation. So thank you.